Liberalism, the way we're going to look at it is as a political theology, which might be a little bit paradoxical because it does have these elements that are supposed to be sort of secularizing effects on it. And we know, well, take a pause for a moment here. Liberalism's one of the most influential ideologies in the contemporary world, in the modern world. And it has generated, I need to say up front, left and right variants, um, what you could call progressive or social versions, also more individualistic and free market versions. Um, it might be characterized very briefly as the political ideology whose major goal or aim is individual autonomy secured through rights of not to non-interference. Okay, so when I say liberal, don't think the culture war, which scrambles up all our brains and we don't think clearly. I'm not saying liberal versus conservative. I'm meaning liberal in that broad sense that might overlap with some parts of the American left and some parts of the American right. But those parts that ideologically hold that the highest goal or aim of society is the securing of individual rights for the purpose of the exercise of autonomy, right? Now, there is a lot of pressure on liberal ideology today in our society that didn't exist actually when I was your guys' age, particularly by conservative Christians. I would say the biggest critics of liberalism and its individualism when I was growing up, with the Cold War just having gone on and then ended, were actually from the left. It was usually socialists. If you heard anyone in American society at all criticize liberalism, it was usually people on the left, the post-liberal left, not the liberal left, right? But today, I actually think the most vocal critics of liberalism are on the right in American society, and they criticize it for different reasons. Namely, and this is why I bring it up, that Christians have begun to question whether liberal ideology is neutral on religion or desirable for religion or somehow corrodes or undermines religion. So you could think of the new right, I'll just say this in aside since you guys are politics students, as having radicalized on the question of liberalism. It could be that the American right is post-liberal, and then you can fill that in with whatever you want. Theocratic or not, authoritarian or not, fascist or not, but post-liberal, ultranationalist or not, but willing to question whether or not you should respect or basically tolerate liberal rights, or if that's even a good deal for Christians or even properly reflects Christian theology. Now, what we're looking at today is what role did Christians play in the construction of liberal ideology? Because if you go backward in time, what you'll find is at the founding of liberal ideology, many of the major thinkers, like the two you read for today, Hugo Grotius and John Locke, were professing, practicing Christians, curiously, of the Reform. So they were Protestants, in other words. And you might see certain features of Protestant political theology resident within liberalism in themes like the autonomy of the individual conscience and no higher communal authority or tradition, right? Things like this. Today we're going to attempt to wrestle with this enormously important question, right? So, but one way we might think of the emergence of liberalism as a political ideology, and I'm going to walk away from it, is as a crisis of authority and search for a minimal ethic and natural reason. Within the sort of story I've been telling in this course, roughly what's going on, is that the Reformation really poses the problem of authority in religion in a new and kind of radical, dynamic way, right? So prior to this, you have, we know, this sort of like notion of apostolic succession, a personalized authority resident in the bishops and in the tradition and the accumulation of the tradition. Luther's, one of his many innovations, one of his big innovations is sola scriptura. And that the individual with their conscience, as we saw in the Diet of Worms, here I stand, I can do no other, is the main and aboriginal authority in Christian life, the conscience and the Bible. Now you could think of what's going on in the early Enlightenment with liberals as, well, sola scriptura seems to have generated, even in Luther's lifetime, 400 different groups I just read recently of Protestantism. So that, and he was hoping that it would actually converge into a universal church around sola scriptura. So then what you have is some people who are part of the Reform saying, hey, you know what? Maybe we need a different public authority. Maybe the public authority needs to be what you could call sola ratio, only reason, right? Maybe only reason. As a minimal, only reason, natural, I'm going to call it natural reason. What do I mean by natural reason? This is a term you see in the history of political thought, you see it in theology. Natural reason can be briefly defined, listen, because it's important, as the exercise of reason without aid or use or supplement by revelation. Again, natural reason is simply the universal human capacity to exercise reason without the aid, supplement of revelation or particular tradition of revelation and of supernaturalism, right? So that's natural reason. And what you could think of what your readings were doing today, Grotius comes out of a particular reformational tradition. It's Arminianism, not to be confused with like the ethnic group, but similarly pronounced, not Lutheran or Calvinist. And Locke comes out of Anglicanism. And a lot of ink has been spilled on, did Locke actually believe in Christian theology or not in his life? Unclear. We'd have to go to the scholars of Locke. People have answered the question in different ways. But what we do know is he was involved in the Anglican Church. He was a practicing Anglican for a lot of his life. So these are basically two different kinds of Protestant. And what they're saying is, you know what? To resolve this crisis of authority we're having around the splintering, Catholics versus Protestants, Anabaptists versus Lutherans, Lutherans versus Calvinists, and so on, many times over. And I should say the confessionalization of states is going on. So certain states are going absolutist in the direction of a particular creedal theology. So for instance, England goes completely, the official church becomes Anglicanism. There's some blowback, like think of Methodists. Within Reform itself, Catholics are largely persecuted during that time. Thomas More, actually that's why he dies, right? But then there's the absolutizing of Catholic creedal beliefs in certain states, like the French state, right? Or the Spanish, think of the Inquisition, right? So you basically have confessionalization of states. And Grotius and Locke, their position is, hey, to solve the crisis of authority, maybe we could have a minimal ethic articulated by natural reason. Sola ratio. And you can see the setup has some echoes with the Reform, because instead of the individual before their Bible, it's the individual before the book of nature, if you like. It's not the Bible per se, it's the exercise of your natural reason before nature. In the reading from Grotius, which is one of the most important seminal texts within liberal political ideology and political theology, it's a huge influence on all kinds of people, you get this definition of a right as a rule of moral action, page 799 of your reading. Right is just a rule of moral action. And Grotius says there's two ways to justify rights. A priori, rules of reason that you can discover before you know any facts, and a posteriori, or proofs of reason that you can know after the fact. Now, we can dwell more deeply into how these justifications work. We got a rather brief reading, so it's not the most robust reading, because the point of them in the course isn't so much to puzzle. I mean, I'd love it if you puzzle over how those arguments work and if you think they're persuasive, but that's actually not the point. The reason I have them in is more to pose the question of what exactly is this doing vis-a-vis the background traditions and political theology that we've been reading. And I think one way to think about it is that Grotius is almost trying to articulate a public framework. And what he's almost saying is Christianity can justify, found, or offer forward a set of rules for action that everyone can accept, Christian or not, Reformed or not. We're going to get back to the limits of tolerance, my question for Brianna, but let's just say it this way for now. It's a universalist ethic because everyone who has reason can accept it. They can be Buddhist, they can be Jewish, they can be, atheist is suspect, but maybe they can be agnostic, they can be any kind of the flavors of the Reform. Maybe Catholicism is suspect, and we can come back to that. But basically, Catholics, if they were thinking straight, or atheists, if they were thinking straight, would be able to still discern through natural reason these rules, right? And I will just say briefly that the a priori proof, which you get on page 800, you get stated on page 800 in the reader, Grotius says that by reasoning from our interest or utilitas, you can know, for instance, that to achieve peace, you shouldn't use deadly force on your neighbor. That's his example of an a priori rule, which we could puzzle over. Obviously, liberals are going to have to enforce rights and use deadly force in some cases. Back to Edward's question about, there's actually a just war theory here, right, in Grotius's theory, but it's a new basis for just war theory in a kind of liberal framework, right? But so presumably it's not a pacifistic doctrine, but he's more like saying, in order to resolve your social conflicts, or this is my attempt to paraphrase what you might be getting at, in order to settle your social conflicts with your neighbors who you might not agree with theologically or in other ways, don't go to the use of deadly force. A rule you can discern, you don't need the Bible to figure that out. You just need your reason. Like if you exercise deadly force quickly in order to solve your social conflicts, that's not conducive to peace, right? And a right is a rule of moral action that's conducive to peace. Second, a posteriori proof, I will just briefly say that Grotius tells us that it's something you can infer about natural right from the fact, this is him on the page 800 again, that it is accepted by all nations, or at least by the more civilized ones, as, quote, the common sense of mankind. All nations have some taboo on the killing of innocents. So this is another route to rights, is as a consensus gentium, which just means a consensus of peoples, right? This is this term up here, a minimal consensus gentium as the law of nations. The law of nations universally becomes, we can put it in a more modern idiom, though Grotius doesn't say it this way, so it is a bit of an anachronism, but the inheritors of this language say human rights, or natural rights, or just your rights. In other words, the idea that there's some minimal consensus gentium that you could discern the rules of rights by just looking at the overlap that all nations, then he hedges it, at least civilized nations have on the treatment of persons, you could start to codify or rationalize a system of rights around that. Now, since our point is to study Christian political theology and not primarily political philosophy, if we were studying political philosophy, we would just focus on that. We would need a lot more reading on that. How does that argument work? Is it a valid argument? And so on. But what we're trying to understand is, how does this, Grotius is a Christian, but he's saying there's this minimal ethic I can discover as a law of peoples, a consensus gentium across all nations, and it's rules for conduct that are conducive to the peace, that are commonsensical rules. Some can be discovered a priori, some a posteriori. Somehow that has a good fit, or is at least valid with starting from a Christian position for Grotius. Christians should be able to publicly affirm rights. Now I'm putting it very simply for a second. Christians should be in favor of rights. So there's something really looming in a big way in the background here. This is my point 4 here. Is there a third private set of theological justifications that we're not reading so much of here? In other words, Grotius, as a convinced and practicing Christian, does he think, yeah, I could give you the reasons in Scripture, maybe humans are made in the image of God, or maybe stuff about conversion requires a change of the heart, and so you can't force a conversion. A forced conversion isn't a real conversion. I mean, you can imagine, those are theological defenses, right? Christianity says you have to fall in love with God to really convert entirely. You can't force someone to convert. Therefore, Christians should be in favor of liberal rights because it respects the fact that you have to appeal to the person's freedom to get them to really convert. And if you don't appeal to their freedom, they really didn't convert, right? Or they're made in the dignity of God, so you have to, part of how you codify that as a Christian is you respect their right even to dissent from God or dissent from the churches or church, right? So right is a reflection of a theological principle of maybe the imago Dei, or humans as sharing in God's reason, or however you want to say it. Locke's account actually in the second treatise, which I assigned in another class, is, well, God owns the property of all creation and humans own their own property. It's kind of proto-capitalist, because what I should say here is this is also the basis for capitalism in a lot of ways, because what Grotius is saying, what Locke will also say. In fact, Grotius spends a lot of time saying one of the main rights you have is to property, right? But that property gets understood here as part of your autonomy. Like part of how you know that you have your rights is that you have a right to property that others can't infringe on. Most importantly and primordially, your body as like a proto form of property. And you could give a theological spin to that, which Locke does in the second treatise, which I don't assign, which is God owns the property of the cosmos. You own the property of your body. You're like a little image of God, like a little property owner, right? And right is a codification of your property of person. So in the background here is a third private set of theological justifications around rights, Now, before I shift over here 1 second to this point about deism, I just want to make clear that what this sets up is a theory of just war where Christians can participate in warfare, for instance, but only in the name of liberal right, not in the name of some other good or purpose or aim, right? Now, is this a rightful development, inheritance, elaboration on Augustine's just war or not is like completely up for grabs. I mean, you can decide that for yourself, but obviously it has some elements of Augustinian theory insofar as there seems to be a discernible earthly city that its goal is peace. It's not the same as the church. So you can see there, are liberals basically Augustinians? And some liberals have understood themselves as Augustinians. I used to assign the great Protestant theologian, American theologian, Lutheran, I believe, Niebuhr, and he basically, I'm an Augustinian and a liberal. And they'll often give the gloss of like this, basically the liberal setup, where you have natural reason setting up the earthly city, is an Augustinian setup, where like I basically work for toleration and an order of individual rights, because I recognize that it's the earthly city and it's what I share with everyone who's Christian or not, right? But what it also sets up is a vision of just warfare, where the reason you can go to war is for right. You can go to war for natural right. You can go to war for this consensus gentium, this law of nations, human rights, and the spread of sort of rights and markets. But you don't go to war for necessarily more narrowly creedal beliefs on this view. Like you don't go to war to make sure everyone becomes Lutheran or everyone becomes Anabaptist. Well, Anabaptists wouldn't go to war, that's a stupid one. But like Calvinist or Catholic, right? You don't do that. That's not, in other words, theological justifications cannot be the public reasons offered. It might be that privately as a Christian participating in a liberal order, you have Christian reasons for wanting to defend the consensus gentium or like natural right or what have you, right? So there is a theory, and in fact, the Grotius text is on war and peace. So like he even presents his case for liberal right as having to do with international relations, if you like, and the idea of, Grotius is very important to the idea of like a international community, that there's an international community and that there are pariah nations. What makes a pariah nation? Not that they're not Christian, that they're illiberal, that they violate people's rights. You see how influential this is. Like what's wrong with North Korea? It violates rights. What's wrong with Russia? It violates rights. What's right with Russia? It asserts Christianity in a muscular way. That's why conservatives are now attracted to Russia, because it's illiberal, but for conservative reasons, if you like. We'll get to like ultranationalism and things like that. But my point is, the liberal setup is, whoa, what's wrong with Russia is they're violating people's rights, And then you may have Christian or non-Christian reasons for being against that, but you have a minimal ethic that you can ascribe to, right, to hold that. So there is in the background this whole issue of private sort of theological justification. So the public morality of Christianity for Grotius and Locke becomes liberalism. You might be privately Lutheran, Anabaptist, Catholic ? But like Calvinist, etc. But publicly what you ought to be is liberal. You ought to be defending people's rights internationally and domestically, right? And so you get this kind of minimal framework or skeletal frame, abstracted frame that is said to have fit privately with a thick theology or revelation that you were not going to be able to sort out publicly. Now, you could see this, and the reaction against liberalism in recent generations often been by Christians been, well, that basically sidelines my religion. My religion has to become unimportant. Or then I have to tolerate more and more things that look unchristian or anti-Christian. Let's briefly call these woke, if you like, right now. That's the question around woke is, are Christians going to tolerate woke? I think woke is a term that makes almost no sense. It means like 5 million different things, but somehow you all know what I mean if I say it briefly, or the function it plays ideologically in our society. Am I going to tolerate that, or is that itself intolerable, right? It has become a question around, if you like, a post-liberal Christian politics in the United States, right? That's intolerable in some sense. So, last point I want to make before turning to Locke is, just like there's a minimal morality that is set up by Christians who founded the liberal tradition, there's also a minimal conception of God. That conception is what you could call deism. Deism is this idea of God as a kind of impersonal first causal mechanism or designer. It's sometimes called the watchmaker God. But the point of deism is that God is not a person. God is a kind of order, right, that exists and secures and starts the whole thing, but doesn't start it as a personal agent, but as almost like a click that starts an uncaused cause, to use Aristotle's term. It's just an uncaused cause. Like through, and by the way, deists are thinking, hey, through natural reason, everyone can accept that, because everyone can accept that if you look at the natural order, you see a bundle of causes, each caused by some prior cause, and finally you must get to some cause that's uncaused cause, and that's the ground of all causes, and that's another way to arrive at God. But what if you just left it in that thin form? And because after all, God as a person is a weird idea. A person, like me here, like you there, a person. In a way, deism kind of resonates already with stuff that's going on here with the scientific revolution, Newton, et cetera, right? Like, okay, it might be easier to think of God if you go way, way out into the universe as a like first cause. But God as a person way out there, let alone all this stuff about the Trinity and Christ in the beginning, the Word was with God and blah, 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 and all this stuff in John's Gospel about Christ is somehow there always already. But what do you mean? Like, he's a person in history, right? So you see, deism is more Unitarian, is how we would put it. It's less Trinitarian, right? Deism gets you Unitarianism. It gets you a unified, transcendental conception of God, but it's also not personal. It's not as a person or as a mind. It's just as a kind of order. There's so much that could be said about this, because the way I used to teach this was, and the religion of the Enlightenment is deism, and the religion of liberalism is deism. But I'm actually not satisfied with that formulation, but that's how I taught it for like 7-8 years, was polemically as liberalism has a religion, the religion is deism. But I'm not sure that's really fair to liberalism, because I think, so here's what I want to say. Some liberals are deists. That's the question around Locke. Does Locke really believe in the personal God of the Bible or of like the patristics or anything? Maybe not. Maybe all he believes in is a first cause. We definitely have people who participated in the liberal Enlightenment that were deists, straight up, front to back. It's very clear in their writings. Thomas Jefferson comes to mind.
Paine.
What's that?
Thomas Paine.
Yes, Thomas Paine. Thomas Jefferson says, I'm just bringing up Thomas Jefferson because I want to flick at it, and I used to sign Jefferson's Bible. Jefferson's Bible is him going through and eliminating all the miracles. And then he's like, I improved it. It's better. Because what he was trying to do is just get at, is there a universal ethic, a kind of like skeletal ethic that coincides with liberalism, right? In fact, most of the founders as an elite group, there were many Christian revolutionaries in the founding, and I know this has become like a hot potato in the ideological wars, but I hate to break it to the conservatives, a lot of the founders were way more openly, robustly, aggressively deistic than anyone who wins the presidency nowadays. I mean, can you imagine winning the presidency, getting on Mount Rushmore, writing the founding documents, and you say, I went through the Bible and improved it by taking out all the miracles? There, it's better. That's what Jefferson publicly did. Now, what's he doing there from the perspective of political theology? The public ethic, what everyone can affirm in the Bible, is its morality and its kind of skeletal structure of a God as a first cause. The rest of it, you can't resolve. That's private. It's not reasonable to try to resolve that, you see? So Jefferson's Bible is an effort at, is there something in the Bible, like a golden rule type setup or a do to others like you would have them do unto you, that somehow is a good fit with what both Grotius and Locke care tremendous about, and Jefferson cares a lot about, which is just establishing orders that respect people's rights. So the Jefferson Bible, in a way, what you keep getting is minimalist efforts at a minimalist framework for public purposes. And then some of the early liberals are deists, and they're like, I don't really believe in a personal God. I don't believe in the Trinity. I don't believe in any of that. And then some of them aren't. Some of them are still Christians, but they just think this is a proper public ethic for Christians to have. And I can offer private theological reasons for that, but publicly, sola ratio. They're part of the Enlightenment. Reason, natural reason alone, becomes the arbitrator in politics. Make sense? Does that make sense? Okay, good. So you get like thin versions of right and morality. You get thin versions metaphysically of God as deistic. And then you even get thinned out versions of the Bible itself as an artifact in Jefferson's hands, which is why I used to sign it. It's a good read. I mean, it's just like a wild read as the history of political thought. And even as an American, you should probably read it, right? Okay, so now a bit on Locke more briefly. So Locke is definitely working within that project, and you could think of Locke as, now in other cases, we could read like Thomas Paine, we could read the radical rationalist enlightenment that's like Christianity's bogus. Those two liberalisms have always been there. You could think of them as almost like left and right liberalisms, or more traditionally Christian liberalism and a more radically rationalistic liberalism, but they've both been there. And by the way, the left often, at least growing up, really liked Jefferson. Granted, there's all this hypocritical stuff. He's got like white supremacy, et cetera, but the left often liked Jefferson growing up because he was more rationalistic. They saw him as more universalistic. They saw him as less partisan to a particular creedal group. So, even the founders that are emphasized by the different groups, right, in American society have to do with attempts to monumentalize a particular ideology as like the governing ideology. But part of the reason why the argument's so tense in American life is they're both there. You can go back and find both. You can find the radical deist. You can find Samuel Langdon giving sermons saying we have to do the revolution because we're a righteous, Puritan, godly people. You find both, So Americans can go back selectively and pick. But the founding documents are in a deistic register, aren't they? They don't say any. That's what's so interesting about the founding documents. They say God. They don't say Jesus. They never say Jesus. They never say Trinity. They always say, it looks like the God of like Islam or Judaism that's completely transcendent, universal, doesn't have a son, etc., right? And so like the founding documents, at least the elites that got a hold of that around the founding were pretty staunchly deistic. They made sure there was no, like the Jefferson Bible, and Jefferson was very responsible for a number of these documents, obviously, they made sure there was no thick theology in there, no substantive creedal theology, right? Now, you could see Locke as basically saying, well, the main virtue that should be practiced in a liberal society that coordinates it is tolerance. And reforming the churches, since these are mostly Protestants writing, there are Catholics that supported liberalization. I assigned Alexis de Tocqueville in another class. But Catholics were very late to accept liberalism. And even now, sometimes you'll hear Catholics are anti-liberal. And in fact, I think one of the reasons the American right is interested in Catholicism, they're like, that's so illiberal. It's going to like stand for Western civilization as a pillar against individualism and relativism and et cetera. So that still has resonances today. I think sometimes people convert to Catholicism for that reason. There are many reasons to convert or not convert or run in terror away from Catholicism. But one of them is, the last pillar against individualism and secularization, right? So we're reading reformers, and there's a reason why reformers are so important to early liberalism, because in a way they're saying, hey, you know what? The rational setup for authority in society is the individual decides through their conscience. And what you can tolerate in religion, my question for Brianna, is a liberalized religion. All the world religions, you even maybe get the emergence of a consensus gentium liberal religion as universal religion. All the world religions are fine. Islam, Buddhism, etc., so long as they liberalize. They undergo a reformation toward liberalizing. Again, you can make Catholicism the other there. Why are there still only male priests? Illiberal. The structure might even be illiberal to what Taylor brought up. You've got a prince or king, apostolic successor in a palace in the Vatican. It's like one of the last kings on earth, right? Like what is going on there? That looks illiberal. You don't vote for them. Only this like other group of clerical elites votes for them in secret, etc. So my point being, well, and by the way, maybe Catholics can liberalize, and that was the big question for John F. Kennedy, the first major public figure that was openly Catholic and became president. The question from the pastors in Houston was, will you follow the Constitution or the Pope? To which his answer was the Constitution. But he might have said, well, I don't see a conflict between the two, because a lot of liberalized Catholics don't, because they see themselves as having properly reformed their tradition toward liberal tolerance. And now a big split in the church is, across the board, Catholic, Protestant, is the liberalizing sides versus the non-liberalizing sides. And weirdly, we've gone through something really weird in America, which is liberalizing Catholics feel closer to liberalizing Protestants, and non-liberalizing Protestants feel closer to non-liberalizing. And so they invented this term orthodoxy, world religion, orthodox. I'm Orthodox Lutheran. I'm Orthodox Catholic. I'm Orthodox, meaning just I still believe all the old traditional stuff, and I'm not going to give way on any of those, versus the liberalizing wings, which want to liberalize the churches. But my point is, Locke is the founder of this idea that the way you reform the churches is you liberalize them, meaning you make them more tolerant, right? And tolerance becomes the central virtue, as he says on page 7, of the true church. Curiously, if you go back to the sources of liberalism, and that's why I'm not comfortable teaching this anymore as just deism is the religion of liberals, what they're actually saying is authentic, true believing Christians should support liberalism and toleration as itself more authentically Christian, which is a bigger challenge to kind of try to resolve for yourselves, because you need to resolve it for yourselves. But like, is the more authentic position Christian? We know we will get to authentic Christian public morality is, Brianna's case, like traditional marriage or whatever. But Locke's is traditional or authentic Christian public morality is toleration. That's what he thinks. The moral you should be worried about in public, Locke thinks, is tolerating people. This is liberal Christianity. I am more Christian by tolerating people, by tolerating pluralism, by bearing with my neighbor and seeing if I can convert them, not through a public seizure of the state or an imposition of like a thick morality on everyone, but actually through bearing with them, respecting their rights, and seeing if I can't convert them through, private means in some sense. The role of the state becomes the establishment of what's permissible, right? And this is another touch point right now. The liberal state, if you like, becomes, so I used to really get polemical about this, but liberal state becomes the arbiter of orthodoxy, of what's permissible to believe or practice. Can the Mormons practice polygamy? Ask the liberal state, right? I'm trying to think of other religious practices that have come under the target of the state. Mormonism is a huge one in American history because it was so violently stamped out, kept moving west, right? But persisted anyway, it must be said, in spite the odds of the state trying to stamp it out as not a permissible form of orthodoxy, not a permissible form of belief or practice. But my real point here is sola ratio and the negotiation of rights within a liberal legal order becomes the way that you sort out. Many of you will go be lawyers in a liberal legal code, if it lasts as a liberal legal code. Serious question. It would have been an absolute laughing joke if I posed that question 10, 15 years ago. In a liberal legal order, arbitrate what you can tolerate, what you can't, the cake, the blah, 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 the marriage, the blah. What is permissible in the coordination of individual right, publicly, right? And so the liberal state becomes the main authority over orthodoxy, if you like, over what you can practice and what you can believe. Whereas what we saw in the patristic and medieval churches, and this is where Locke is right to smell something somewhat suspect about Catholicism, is a seeming sovereign that transcends any particular social contract, having stuff to say about it, right? So possibly, now, okay, and I used to be more polemical about this, and I have ceased to be so because I find it like there might be something more challenging here afoot, but like, I think the view of someone who defends like Thomas Aquinas, my friends are Thomists, which is the name for people who like subscribe to Thomas Aquinas, which you'll find in Catholic circles sometimes. I'm not a Thomist, but I am friends with some Thomists. What they'll say is, liberals worship the state. They don't worship the church. The state tells them what to die for. The state tells them what to believe. The state tells them what to practice, right? Why I don't feel comfortable with that is I think there are Christians across the board who what they're trying to say is, I have a thick theology, I have a thick revelation, I have a substantive Christian position, I just think it issues forth in the need for a public square that makes toleration a major feature of it, and pluralism a major feature of it, right? So it's not so much that I don't, and by the way, the papacy made its peace with liberalism, sort of, probably about 100 years ago, very late. Most of the reformational churches much earlier, right? But, about 100 years, I forget the Vatican document, whatever. Big question here for the political theologians we'll go on reading, I know I'm going over time, so I'll end soon, is the liberal state neutral on religion, or does it even need to be, right? And that's another way to think of what's happened, is that questions of what's tolerable or questions about what the consensus gentium is on public morality have started to pluralize and diversify more. So part of what's happened to conservatives is a sort of scandal or question or worry or anxiety about how much fragmentation or change you can have around, because the narrative around, I think, conservative Christianity, so it would have been fine to be liberal 50 years ago, the silent majority, et cetera, but what if it's just the silent, not very silent, the very loud and raucous minority, but not the silent majority? You know, in the 80s, the position was everyone is silently Christian, there are a few loud liberals, et cetera, and now it's like, number-wise, it's mostly nuns, et cetera. You have waves of change around feminism, gender politics, et cetera, et cetera. So, maybe liberalism continually deciding in favor of individual right is actually sort of taking apart or dissolving the Christian inheritance or the Christian political order, so maybe Christians can't be as tolerant anymore. I'm trying to make this a difficult question for us because the country is living through this issue, right? Is when the liberal state decides the cake issue, like Brianna brought up, is it being neutral and using solo ratio affirmation, or is it siding with, right, against, is it siding with individualist liberalism against communal forms of Christianity and traditional morality, et cetera, right? Final two things I'll say very much more briefly are, this involves, it clearly involves a privatization of faith, but we already saw in Luther that you're two persons. There's a public person that can slash and burn and a private person that, you know, can be saved by God's grace, and they don't really ever meet. So you can almost see this as like a secularization of some aspects of Luther's beliefs. Granted that Locke and Grotius' view is not that you're not really acting like a Christian in public, it's just you're acting out a thin part of the ethic in the public sphere. So it's not quite the same as Luther, but you see there's like a split, and you could see it as a privatization of faith, or at least question mark, does it basically mean that you privatize faith? And what becomes more important, now may put it in a way that resonates with people on the left, is markets. Like, what do Christians worship? Rights and markets and money, not actually like poverty or radical Christian witness or anything like that, right? So there's this issue of privatization, but also the Reform's great stress, and by the way, Catholics took this up later through the Counter-Reformation, but of personalism. I brought this up already. Like, do you really believe? In the medieval world, there were different speeds at which you could occupy the church. People didn't really ask, does this one peasant really believe? They didn't care. They thought everyone was communally saved, or not. But like, it was communal. So you didn't ask, hey, can this peasant really give the creed? In fact, who really cares? Let's put it in Latin. Are they coming and receiving the sacraments? Good enough. Reform and counter-reform lead to this war almost over souls, over who really believes, and can you repeat Catholic answers or Protestant answers, et cetera, et cetera. Now, behind that is not just something negative, it's a personalism of belief. Like, we want to know now, do people really believe? And Locke, in a way, is saying something similar. It's like, if you want to know if people really believe, defend their rights so that they're not being coerced into it by a state or by a social group. You might have fewer people Christian, but they'll actually be Christian, actually be able to say what they believe and enthusiastically pursue it. Whereas in Russia right now, maybe they're like, I'm Orthodox, yay. But like, this is the liberal view, but like millions are actually like, I hate this, it's bogus, it's stupid, it's a religion of power, right? So Locke's view is, if you go illiberal, you don't really have faith. So Locke's view is that liberalization is actually good for Christianity, and paradoxically, secularization is good for Christianity. Secularism is in the doctrine, narrowly here, because there are different definitions of secularism, of the separation of church and state, and this is what I'll end on, because clearly liberals are huge advocates for the separation of church and state. It's one of the major features of the American Constitution. The Establishment Clause of like, Congress shall not establish any creed, et cetera, et cetera. The state shall remain liberal and neutral, solo ratio, not a particular religious set of beliefs. Liberal Christian, Thomas Paine is clapping maybe because he's like, yes, less Christianity. But liberal Christians are like, good, more authentic, enthusiastic, real Christianity arrived at through your freedom and not through, and that's Locke's position. He's like, it's actually better for the church. Maybe I'll end with Locke saying something. It's actually better for the church. Page 13, I'll let John Locke have the last word and then we'll take a break. All the life and power of true religion consists in the inward and full persuasion of the mind. All the life and power of true religion consists in the inward and full persuasion of the mind. So the reason you need a secular square, the reason you need individual rights, the reason you need tolerance is because you want to have true religion as a full persuasion of the mind, not as like socially coerced or coerced through a particular sectarian takeover of the state. Each man has the care of souls and of his own salvation, also on page 13. The care of every man's soul belongs unto himself, page 26.